So if you're struggling to add authentication to your Next.js application, in this video, we're going to see how you can add authentication with stuff like, continue with Google, continue with GitHub or Facebook or any other OAuth provider, or even with like email and password to your like Next.js and React application in 5 minutes. And the best part about all of this, actually you can implement those using the new Next.js server components and client components. So you're going to have everything new. I'm going to implement advanced OAuth authentication with like Google, where you can click, continue with Google. It's going to take you, accounts to Google in here to choose an account. You can select an account after that, and it's just going to immediately authenticate you in here, just take you to your timeline in here, where you can see the email you authenticated with. It's going to create a session token with you, create a cookie for you, an HTTPS only cookie. It's very secure, very well thought of, and it just works perfectly. So if you're new to Next.js or just getting started with Next.js and you want to add authentication to stuff like email, password, or something like, continue with Google, continue with GitHub or Facebook or any other like OAuth provider. So there is a really awesome library that allows you to do exactly that, but it's just going to make things a lot easier because they actually have created everything. So you can just install the library and use the like built-in providers, built-ins, authentication mechanism, and so much more. The library here is called NextAuth.js. So there's actually a really awesome library. It's pretty secure, pretty well thought of. They have a pretty awesome, nice features. Anything you pretty much would think about implementing in the realm of authentication or Next.js and authentication, you're gonna find it particularly implemented in this library, from simple email and password to very advanced stuff like OAuth. So to get started with this, all you gotta do is go ahead and get started in here. And there's actually one thing before we get started, because as we know, there is a new version of Next.js, like Next.js 13.4 has put a stable release of the app directory instead of using the pages directory. So likely for us, Next.js in here or the NextAuth.js library in here actually has guides for both. So if you're either using the old one or the newer one. So to get started with this, simply just go ahead and do npm or yarn or anything. Just add this one using npm. So add NextAuth into your project, and you're gonna go jump into that one. It's close in here telling you, you add the API route in here. So whether you're using pages or the app route, you simply go ahead and create a configuration with this and initialize the NextAuth in here, which is going to be provided. So in our case, what we want to do is actually we have a simple application here. It's like a Twitter clone we built in the previous video tutorial about Next.js 13.4. Well, this one is pretty simple. It uses some SQLite database where you can just log in here and log out, and you can just basically, view the tweets in here. You can add comments. You can go to a tweet, view other comments, and yada, yada, yada. So what we want to use NextAuth.js library, and we're going to add authentication to this particular application where the user can click in here and log out, can actually, before you can view this, we want to just display a login. So you say please, you need to first log in order to be able to view the Twitter timeline, so much more. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So we're going to add authentication to this Next.js application. So this is actually our project setup. We have an application, we have inside of the app directory, we have a timeline to show the layout, the page, and how an actual or the newer Next.js application are structured. And we've got a lib folder. So inside of this lib folder in here, so I want to go ahead and create some configuration. So I'm going to add an auth.typescript, which is a file that's going to allow me to just export some configuration for the authentication purpose. So this one I'm going to add first an object. So it's going to be calling this authconfig. I'm going to export the objects, which is going to be NextAuth options, which is mainly going to take the providers. Now the providers in here are pretty straightforward. NextAuth has actually plenty of providers, going from credentials, which are email and password, or going from single sign-on for continue login with Google, or login with GitHub, Facebook, those kind of providers, or login with an email link, like an OTP link or SMS, something of that sort. So they have all of those. So we need to specify the configuration of those providers and the secret, the password to use, for example, Google sign-on, or how to handle the authentication with the database. Everything is going to be handled inside of that object. So the first thing here, make sure to go ahead and import the credentials provider from the provider's credentials of NextAuth provider's credentials. And here you can just go ahead and put the objects. So do credentials provider, and here you give it the configuration object for that. And for this one, I'm going to go ahead and add a name, credentials. In this particular object, you add what are the sign-in credentials. You can even add like first name. You can even add like username instead of an email, but that's what I'm going to be using in here. I'm going to use email, label, type, placeholder, and likely for us, there's actually a really awesome feature. That's why we're adding a placeholder in here and a type email, because NextAuth, the library, is going to like, it's going to immediately read those. It's going to generate for us a form that's going to just work right out of the box. It's going to add it into a URL, so you don't have to worry about it. So if you want to use that, built-in form, you can do it, or you can customize it and add that authentication method to your custom form. So here, after adding the credentials in here, there's actually the next important thing, which is like knowing or when the user is actually logged in. How do we verify the user is actually logged in or not? So this one, what I'm doing, this credentials in here are going to be like email and password. So record of an email and password, the same thing that you put on top in here. So you're going to check, if there's no credentials or email and password, just return null. Or here, secondly, just go ahead and use the Prisma or whatever database ORM you're going to be using. So you're going to add or grab the DB user, which is with the email provided. Then you're going to go do some like password checking. So usually in here, you're going like to do some encryption to check the password, because 99% of the times in a production ready database, passwords are encrypted. But in our case in here, they're not, just to make it simple, but mainly they are encrypted using bcrypt. So you can just go ahead and encrypt that. You can double check, if password is right, all we simply need to go ahead and do is actually return the user objects in here, which are going to have the email and email. That's it. And you make sure just to remove the password and other fields that are not related. Otherwise, if the user fails to authenticate and we can't actually find a database or the password doesn't match, what we can do is go ahead and return null. And this will actually tell NextAuth it's going to return an error for us, and this will not, it will not authenticate the user. We just like stop it, and it doesn't allow it to go any further. So the first provider here is the credentials provider. Now we can add other providers. Let's say in our case in here, what I want to use continue with Google, and I want to use continue with GitHub. So for that, I can just go ahead and add two more providers. There's the Google provider and there's the GitHub provider. You can just import them the same thing from the providers folder inside of the NextAuth library. So 99% of the times, most of the providers are going to have or take the same options, which requires an OAuth 2 options, which are client ID and the client secret. Like you're wondering basically, from where can I get those? Good question. So for example, for Google, what you go to is actually go to console.cloud.google.com, which is, or you can just type in on Google console, and it's just going to take you here. So here you need to create, you have to have your Google account with you in here, and then just going to immediately for you, it's going to have it in here. So you can just go ahead and create a new project, or you can just go ahead and have a quick access. So from here, you can just go and do like view all products, and it's going to take you to the list of all products in here that are available. And you have to search for APIs and services. Now, APIs and services is actually the one's going to allow you to generate an OAuth client and actually use the ability to use like Google to sign in users into your like database, into your like application. So once your API services, you go to credentials, and in this one, this is actually where you create the credentials. Because in here, you go inside of OAuth 2.0 client IDs, and this is exactly where you need to create them. So I already created the Next.js auth in here, but you can just go ahead and do create credentials in here, and you can just go ahead and add like OAuth client, and simply this would just go ahead and like give you an application type. For us, it's a web application, but you need to choose one. If you're using something else, you give it a name in here, and here there's actually the most important step. You need to add the URI and the authorized redirect URIs. So from where would you get those? So if you go to the NextAuth library documentation here, go to providers, and you scroll down a little bit, you go to Google, you find Google here, this actually shows you the configuration, and down here is actually going to tell you where the URIs are. So for example, in here for production, this is the callback URI, but for development, this is actually the callback URI. So you can just copy this one, go back in here. The callback URI is actually the redirect URI, where the user going to be redirected after he logs in. And this is actually the URL for the application. For our application, it runs localhost. So I can just put, localhost 3000 in here, and that's it. I can just go and click, web application, web client, create in here. That's going to create for me an application. And there you go. It's going to give you the client ID in here and the client secret, as simple as that. So you need to make sure to go ahead and copy both of these and actually put them in the env file, and you're good to go. Now you can just go ahead and use them. Now, if you go to the .env or wherever you set your environment variables, but .env for Next.js, you put the Google client ID and you put the client and the secret and the GitHub as well. The other thing that NextAuth needs to, in order to operate correctly, is actually you need to put NextAuth secret, which is going to be a secret to sign and encrypt GWT tokens, because NextAuth is going to use GWT tokens to keep a session inside of your browser. So you make sure here to put a random password secret that's going to be very long and very random. And here you put the URL of your application. And simply as that, you just go to Google provider and GitHub provider and use those secrets, and that's all of it. And the initialization is done now. Now we can use Google, GitHub, and credentials to actually authenticate our users. Now to finalize the configuration of NextAuth, you go to the app in here, you create an API auth, and you created the same thing in here with like, it's an array .NextAuth, and this actually needs to be read by NextAuth. You have to put it exactly like this, and you create like a route.typescript. It needs that. The newer Next.js 13.4 needs that. And here you just use the configuration created and you initialize auth, and you make sure you export the handlers both at a GET request and a POST. And like this, you're done with initialization. All right, now it's time actually to integrate this, the authentication with our application, and add a form, add a buttons to log in with Google, GitHub, and so on and so forth. So what I did in here for application, I went to the page.typescript, which is like the main page for the website in here, and this actually I'm going to take it as a sign in. So here I'm going to do a sign in page and actually return a sign in page in here, where there's a button for Google sign in, a GitHub button in here to sign in with GitHub, and have like then a form to credential sign in using email and password. And this actually what it looks like. So continue with Google, continue with GitHub, and you have got the two, email and password and a login button. So this, if you want to create a customized version of your form and actually customize it however you want, but likely for us, there's actually another version that generates or gets generated automatically from you when you add the configuration for like the NextAuth in here, is if you go to the API auth sign in, which is the same URL you put, the NextAuth in here, here you're gonna find something generated for you out of the box. As you in here, you find an email and password and sign in, or you find, the two buttons, continue with Google and continue with GitHub, and likely just right out of the box, all of this in here just works, like literally just works. Like for example, if I open the application in here to check if any cookies are added or not. So if you try this one and put in just like an email and password on the form that was generated and click, oh, I want to just go and sign in, squeeze in here, a new session token has been generated for us and actually did sign us in here, and everything just works just flawlessly. And for you, all you had to do is just basically add the configuration in here, and that's it. That's all you gotta do. And if you wanna just, for example, try the sign in with Google option in here, you can just click on it right out of the box, and that should just go ahead and sign you in with your like accounts and whatever, if you have that already set up. And this is how you can add authentication in like around 5 minutes to your Next.js application. All right, awesome. Now let's go back to our original form, our custom form in here, which we want to add the ability to authenticate to this with Google, GitHub, and whatever in here. So we don't want to use the generated form for us. We want to do something special for us. We want to use a custom form, a custom design, so much more. So how can we do that? Yes, the API is ready, and API is pretty simple to use that. So if you go back to the code in here, and for example, go to the credentials form. This is actually the form where it allows you to put your email, put your password in here, and actually log in using that. So how can we add the ability to do that? So all you're gonna do, make sure to mark this as a user client, because this has to be a client component, otherwise you can't do event handlers and so much more. You maybe can use server actions, but they're still in the alpha version, so I don't want to just go ahead and risk doing that with authentication particularly. So I want to just use clients in here and just do it and work with it using Next.js. So I'm going to add a handle submit in here. I'm going to make sure to prevent default and grab the form data in here using the current target. We have the data. The second thing in here, I'm going to call a function, which is a special function going to be imported from the NextAuth/React. So this will allow us to go ahead and sign in. So we just provide in sign in, you provide what is the type of sign in or provider. In our case, it has to be credentials. You can put Google or GitHub in there. And the second option here is actually the data you want to put. So for the data, you can have email, password, and here you can put redirect false. Why? Because if, for example, you got an error, if you put redirect true in here, it's going to redirect you to the generated form. Like it's going to redirect to all the URL to show the error. But we don't want that because that's going to look horrible in the user experience. So I want to handle the error at the same component in here without doing any redirect or refresh. And here, after that, I can just go ahead and do like, oh, check in. If signing in response and like there is no error, I can just go ahead and redirect to the timeline because I'm authenticated, right? That's cool. But if it's not authenticated, I'm just going to do a set state error. I'm going to say, oh, your email or password is wrong in here. I'm just going to log it out. I'm going to display the error and I'm done. So if I go back in here, let's say, for example, I'm going to put, a wrong email that's going to, just going to be wrong in here, a wrong password. I try to log in. There you go. It tells me the error. Oh, your email or password is wrong. You can't do that. But let's say I'm going to use the right one in here. I'm going to do login. And as soon as I log in, it's going to redirected me into the timeline in here. I can see the tweet. I can just work fine. It just works flawlessly. All right, so let's go ahead and add the continue with Google and make it work, as well as continue with GitHub buttons. Now, inside of the page in here, inside of the main form in here, what I had to do is actually extract those. So because this one is actually a server component, so I didn't want to actually make the whole component in here a client component. So instead, what I did, I extracted the parts that needs to be client into a separate component. And that's actually going to save you a lot in performance when loading the website for users. So here, those components are a client component. For example, in here, what I put auth buttons in here, which are going to be a use client, which is a use client component in here. And here I have a couple of components. All of them uses on click and stuff like that in order to authorize users. So what I'm doing, for example, Google sign in button here has a handle click, and all it does, literally all it does, it calls the same function that we did use before for credentials, but now it calls sign in and it just tells it to use Google. That's it. And literally everything is going to be handled behind the scenes for you using the NextAuth library. So all you got to do is just call this function, sit back and relax. And the same thing here goes for GitHub in here. So we have that working as well. So now if we try to continue with Google now, Sequelize in here just takes us to accounts.google.com, and this is actually where we're going to use the OAuth, and you can use any your authenticated user account in here. For example, I'm going to choose my account in here, click enter, and that's just going to authenticate me, take me to the timeline, put the cookie there as well, like the session token cookie, which is a DWT token, and so much more, and it just works flawlessly. If you want to try GitHub, so you can do continue with GitHub as well in here. It's going to take you to GitHub. It's going to authenticate you because I already authenticated and have only one GitHub account open. So it's going to do that flawlessly for you and just quickly as that. Now, the last part of authentication or adding authentication to your application is actually managing the session or getting the current user's data, like the current logged in user's data inside of the application. So for example, if we go to timeline in here and page.tsx, let's say what we want to do is actually display the user name, the currently logged in username on that particular timeline page. So I'm going to do in here, to use that, there's actually two ways. So it depends on exactly when or where you want to use it. So if you want to use it inside of the server, inside of an API route, for example, an API route like this, or inside server components, as we have in here, inside of server component here, which is going to be rendered and run inside of the server, you can use the get server session function from the next. So in here, I can do session equals get server session, which is a function that you can just give it the auth options that you have. So you have to give it the auth options. So you can just auth config in here from a file in here. So you have to give it that one. And this, likely for us, it will be a session, but you have to wait for this in order to make sure it works perfectly. And what we can simply just go ahead and do in here, for example, I can just, before rendering the tweets, what I'm going to do is simply just going to put it like this. I'm going to say, oh, H3, this is your timeline, something like this. And this is your timeline. I'm going to do session.user. It's going to give you the user. You can have email, image, and name. So I can just go do an email. I can also use the image in here if I ever wanted to. So you can do something like, image, I can just do src session.user.image. I can just add some check-in in here and we're good to go. So now if I use my Google account in here to sign in, there you go. It just tells me, this is your timeline. It gives you the email perfectly. It's clear in here. This is actually how you get the session and how you manage it. The last thing we want to do for our application is actually protecting routes. For example, this timeline in here, we want only authenticated and logged in users to be able to view this route. Unless if any other user that is not authenticated or logged in just yet, if he goes to that route, we want to redirect him back to the login page. So now, for example, if I log out, and that actually just, it doesn't actually take me anywhere because I'm logged out, right? So I can go back to login in here. I can go back to timeline and I'm not logged in, right? I'm not logged in. I can go back to timeline in here. There you go. as curious in here, to prove that I'm not logged in, there's no session, there's no data, and I still be able to view the timeline, which is, pretty bad. I don't want to do that. So what I did in here is actually went through and I created two utility helper functions. One is called like login is required on the server, that you can call it on the server component, and this one you can call it on the client component. So simply what we're doing on the server, get server side, like get server session, and if there's no session, we simply use the redirect. It's going to redirect him back to the login page. On the other side here for the clients, what we do is actually use the session hook, which is going to provide it with a session, and we're going to grab the router, and if there's no session, we just simply just go ahead and redirect him back to the login page. So you can just go ahead and use those, both of those, back in here, as curious in here. So simply all I gotta do in here inside of the timeline is actually do await login is required, and then make sure to use the server because I am inside of a server component, right? So I do login is required. So now if we go back to it and try to, flawlessly go to the timeline, and click on the timeline, it tries to load some stuff, but it just, redirects you back over here because you have no session. You can't be there and you cannot be authenticated. The other one I'm going to do is actually inside of the login page in here, we're going to grab the session as well, and we check, if there is a session, we just redirect him to the timeline, because why would you let the user view a login page if he's like already logged in, right? That doesn't make sense. So we just like redirect him to the timeline because he's already logged in. So let's say we want to we're on the side of the timeline here, right? And we try to go to the login page. It doesn't allow us. It just immediately redirects us in here, and that works flawlessly again. So anyway guys, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the authentication process with this really awesome library on the new Next.js. Anyway guys, catch you hopefully in the next ones.